What if I told you that some crimes were so shocking, so brutal, so unbelievably evil that they didn't just make headlines? They changed laws. They changed societies. They changed the way entire nations thought about safety, justice, and human nature. These are not ordinary crimes. These are the cases that made the world stop. The cases that made people lock their doors and question everything they thought they knew about the people around them. Every single story you are about to hear is real. Every detail is documented, and every one of them will stay with you long after this video ends. Stay with me. Before we begin, understand something important about the crimes on this list. They were not shocking simply because of their violence. Many crimes are violent. What made these cases different, what burned them into the consciousness of entire generations, was the combination of factors that surrounded them. The identity of the perpetrators, the vulnerability of the victims, the scale of the betrayal involved, the failures of the systems that were supposed to prevent them, and in many cases, the chilling ordinariness of the people responsible, because that is the most disturbing truth about the worst crimes in human history. They were almost never committed by monsters who looked like monsters. They were committed by neighbors, by trusted authority figures, by people who smiled at you in the street, by people nobody ever suspected until it was too late. We begin in the United States, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Wichita, Kansas, where between 1974 and 1991, a man who was known to his neighbors as a helpful, friendly, church-going community leader was secretly living a double life that is almost impossible to comprehend. His name was Dennis Rader, and he called himself BTK Bind, torture, kill. Those three words were not just a description of what he did. They were his identity, his brand, his signature. Rader committed his first murders in January 1974, killing 4 members of the Otero family in their own home: a father, a mother, a son, and an 11-year-old daughter. He was 29 years old. He had planned the murders in meticulous detail. He had cut the phone lines before entering. He had brought his own rope. This was not impulsive. This was deliberate. This was organized. And after it was done, Dennis Rader went home. He went back to his job as a compliance officer for the city of Wichita. He went back to his wife and children. He went back to his church, where he eventually became president of the congregation. And he killed again, and again, and again. Over 17 years, Rader murdered 10 people. Between murders, he sent taunting letters to police and newspapers, describing his crimes in detail, giving himself his BTK name, demanding attention, demanding recognition, and then, for years, going completely silent, living his normal life, going to church, raising his children, being a good neighbor. In 2004, after years of silence, BTK contacted a local television station again. He wanted to know if a floppy disk he sent could be traced. Police told him, through a fake message, that it could not be traced. Rader sent the disk. Police immediately traced it to a computer at his church. Dennis Rader was arrested in February 2005. He had been free for 31 years. His wife of 34 years had no idea. His children had no idea. His congregation had no idea. The man they trusted, the man they prayed with, had been one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and nobody knew. From Kansas, we traveled to Belgium, to a case that did not just shock a nation, it destroyed the public's faith in their entire government and law enforcement system, and triggered the largest public demonstration in Belgian history. This is the case of Marc Dutroux, and it is one of the darkest stories you will ever hear. Marc Dutroux was a convicted child abuser who had been released from prison early in 1992, despite warnings from psychiatrists that he was extremely dangerous and should not be released. He had served only 3 years of a 13-year sentence. After his release, Dutroux began building soundproofed cells in the basement of one of his properties. Between 1995 and 1996, he abducted 6 young girls in Belgium. The youngest was 8 years old. He kept them imprisoned in his basement. He abused them. He filmed the abuse. 2 of the girls, 8-year-old Julie Lejeune and 8-year-old Melissa Russo, died of starvation while Dutroux was in prison on an unrelated charge. While he was in prison, his wife, who knew about the children, did not feed them. They died alone in a basement, in the dark, waiting for someone to come. In August 1996, Police finally searched Dutroux's property after receiving a tip. They found two surviving girls, Sabine Dardenne, aged 14, and Laetitia Delhez, aged 12, hidden in the basement. They had been held for months. What made this case even more shocking than the crimes themselves was what the investigation revealed about how it had been allowed to happen. Belgian police had received multiple tips pointing to Dutroux in the months before the girls were found. Officers had actually searched his house while the girls were imprisoned in the basement and had heard children's voices, but had not investigated further. A police officer had even found a list of names in Dutroux's possession, names of potential victims, and had done nothing with it. The failures were so catastrophic, so inexplicable, that many Belgians began to believe that Dutroux had not acted alone, that he had been protected, that there were powerful people involved who did not want him caught. In October 1996, 300,000 Belgians marched through the streets of Brussels in what became known as the White March, the largest demonstration in the country's peacetime history, demanding justice, demanding answers, demanding that their government explain how this had been allowed to happen. Marc Dutroux was finally convicted in 2004. He is serving a life sentence in a Belgian prison. The questions about how he operated for so long and whether he had protection have never been fully answered. From Belgium, we go to the United States again, to a case that reveals something profoundly disturbing about the relationship between wealth, power, and justice. The case of Jeffrey Epstein. A case that involves some of the most powerful people in the world. A case with victims in the dozens, possibly the hundreds. And a case that, in its most important aspects, remains unsolved. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier, a man of enormous wealth whose exact source of income has never been fully explained. He moved in the highest circles of global power, counting presidents, princes, prime ministers, and billionaires among his associates. He owned a private island in the Caribbean, a private jet that became known as the Lolita Express, multiple enormous properties across America and Europe. He had access, connections, and influence that almost no private citizen has ever possessed, and he used all of it, for decades, to abuse young girls. Girls who were recruited from disadvantaged backgrounds, girls who were promised money and opportunity, girls who were instead exploited in ways that have been described in court documents that are deeply disturbing to read. Epstein had already been arrested once, in 2008, in Florida. He should have faced federal charges that could have sent him to prison for decades. Instead, through a legal agreement that prosecutors have since described as a sweetheart deal, he served 13 months in a private wing of a county jail, during which he was allowed to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for what were described as work release purposes. The agreement also gave immunity from federal prosecution to any co-conspirators, unnamed, unidentified, protected. In July 2019, Epstein was arrested again, this time on federal sex trafficking charges. He was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. In August 2019, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was ruled suicide by hanging. But the circumstances surrounding his death have been questioned by forensic pathologists, legal experts, and investigators ever since. The jail's surveillance cameras outside his cell malfunctioned on the night of his death. His cellmate had been transferred the day before. Guards who were supposed to check on him did not. The forensic pathologist who examined his body concluded that the injuries were more consistent with homicide than suicide. Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirators, the people who were given immunity in 2008, have never been fully identified or prosecuted. His associates, the powerful men whose names appear in his private flight logs and his private contact books, have faced almost no legal consequences. The girls he abused, now women, are still waiting for justice that has never fully arrived. He opened fire for over an hour on a small island with no escape. Breivik hunted and killed 69 people. The majority of them were teenagers, young people who had gathered to participate in democracy, to learn about politics, to build the future of their country. The oldest victim was 51. The youngest was 14. Norwegian police took 90 minutes to reach the island after the shooting began, a delay that has been the subject of extensive investigation and criticism. When Breivik was finally arrested, he was calm. He showed no remorse. He explained his ideology, a violent far-right extremism that he had documented in a 1,500-page manifesto that he had emailed to thousands of people hours before the attacks. He had posted extensively on extremist online forums for years. The warning signs had been there. Nobody had acted on them. Breivik was convicted and sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence under Norwegian law at the time, a sentence that many victims' families felt was completely inadequate for a man who had killed 77 people. From Norway, we go to India, to a case that sparked a national conversation about violence, gender, and justice that continues to this day. On the night of December 16, 2012, a 23-year-old woman who was a medical student boarded a bus in New Delhi with a male friend. What happened on that bus over the next hour shocked not just India, but the entire world. She was attacked by 6 men on the bus. She was beaten. She was assaulted with an iron rod in ways that caused injuries so severe that she died 13 days later in a hospital in Singapore. Her male companion was also beaten, but survived. The case, which became known internationally simply as the Delhi gang rape case, triggered mass protests across India. Thousands of people took to the streets in cities across the country, demanding justice, demanding change, demanding that the government address the epidemic of violence against women that had been ignored for too long. The protests were met with water cannons and tear gas. The 5 surviving accused were convicted and sentenced to death, sentences that were carried out in March 2020. The 6th accused, who was a minor at the time of the crime, was sentenced to 3 years in a reform facility and released. The victim's identity was protected by Indian law, but she became known around the world by a name that her parents gave her in death, Nirbhaya, which means fearless. Her case changed laws in India. It changed the conversation about women's safety in public spaces. It sparked a movement that continues to grow. But it did not end the problem it represented. In the years since Nirbhaya's death, cases of violence against women in India have continued to be reported at alarming rates. The conversation she started with her life is still unfinished. From India, we return to the United States for a case that is in many ways the most instructive on this list because it reveals something fundamental about the nature of institutional failure, the case of Larry Nassar, a doctor who worked for USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University for decades, a man who was trusted with the bodies and the health of some of America's most elite young athletes, and who used that trust systematically, repeatedly, over more than 2 decades to abuse over 300 girls and women. 300. The number is so large that it is difficult to comprehend. These were not random victims. These were young women who came to Nassar for medical treatment, who were told that what he was doing was legitimate medical procedure, who trusted him because he was a doctor, because he worked for organizations that were supposed to protect them, because he had been vouched for by coaches and administrators and institutions that carried authority. Complaints about Nassar had been made to Michigan State University as early as 1997. Nothing was done. USA Gymnastics received a complaint in 2015. They conducted an internal investigation without notifying law enforcement for 5 weeks before finally contacting the FBI. The FBI received the complaint and took over a year to begin a proper investigation. During that year, Nassar continued to treat patients. During that year, more girls were abused. The institutional failures that allowed Nassar to operate for so long, the deliberate ignorance, the prioritization of reputation over safety, the silencing of victims, resulted in criminal charges against multiple officials at Michigan State University. The FBI agents who mishandled the initial investigation were referred for criminal prosecution. Larry Nassar himself was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison. He will never leave. What connects all of these cases, BTK in Kansas, Dutroux in Belgium, Epstein in New York, Breivik in Norway, the Delhi case in India, Nassar in Michigan, is not simply that they were shocking. It is what they reveal about the systems that were supposed to prevent them. In every single case, there were warning signs. In every single case, there were complaints that were ignored. In every single case, there were people in positions of authority who knew something was wrong and chose to look away, chose to protect institutions over individuals, chose to protect the powerful over the vulnerable. The most disturbing truth about the crimes that shock the world is not that they happen. It is that in almost every case, they could have been stopped earlier by the systems we built specifically to stop them. The systems failed, and the people who paid the price for those failures were always the same. The most vulnerable people in our society, the people who had the least power, the least protection, the least ability to make anyone listen. These cases are not just history, they are a warning about what happens when we stop paying attention, when we trust institutions blindly, when we allow power to go unchecked. The world was shocked by these crimes. The question is, did it learn from them? Subscribe to VaultX Mysteries, because the vault goes deeper than you think, and we are just getting started.